So in our last lecture, we talked about the First World War and how that's going to have some dramatic effects on how Europe looks. The map is going to change, for example. And then we have the understanding that the world just fought, or Europe in particular, just fought the most devastating war that humankind has ever fought, and it was fought in 4 short years, right? In the post-war world, we've got the establishment, and this was built right into the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war with Germany. The first articles of the Treaty of Versailles established the idea of the League of Nations, all right? So in the post-war world, we now have an international organization. Rather than countries kind of deciding everything on their own on how to carry out their own situations and how to possibly solve the problems that they're presented with, now we have a League of Nations that is meant to have officials from the various nations of the world get together and talk and hopefully work out problems when they arise. And if conflicts do arise, now we've got an international organization that is meant to provide, let me give you this phrase here, what's known as collective security. It is meant to provide collective security, essentially meaning this: if a member of the League of Nations is threatened by aggressive action, other members of the League of Nations should stand together to stop that aggression. But the League of Nations is going to have some challenges right from its birth. First and foremost, the United States, after World War I, one of the most powerful economic nations in the world, one of the strongest militaries in the world, virtually unparalleled in terms of resources. The United States will not join the League of Nations. It is our president, Woodrow Wilson, that has the idea of creating the League of Nations. And that's what Woodrow Wilson tries to push into the Treaty of Versailles. And he gets it. But of course, you guys remember from APUSH, the American president does not sign treaties. He can come up with them, he can work them out, but he doesn't ratify treaties. That's the job of the American Senate. So after the Treaty of Versailles is worked out, it goes to the United States. Everybody else can sign it and do what they want with it. But for the United States, the treaty comes to us, and it is now debated before the U.S. Senate. And the U.S. Senate, led by Republicans in 1920, they're going to reject the Treaty of Versailles, and as such, reject the League of Nations. And the reason they reject it is because of the League of Nations, because Republicans in the American Senate, just after having fought a very expensive war in Europe, even though we were only there for a year, Republicans in the American Senate don't want to have some international organization compelling the United States to put military overseas. And the United States reverts to being a more isolationist nation when it comes to foreign policy, especially European problems. We don't want to be dragged into war because 2 European nations have beef with each other. So the United States does not join the League of Nations. Tyler.
So the United States did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles?
We did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles.
We didn't sign it?
We didn't sign that. Woodrow Wilson worked on it. I mean, Woodrow Wilson's signature might be somewhere, but it does not mean it's ratified by the American Senate. We never agreed officially to the Treaty of Versailles because separation of powers in the American constitutional democracy, that's the Senate's job to ratify treaties. Yes?
That's I feel like that's unique in the United States only, because if you look at all the other European nations, they don't have that kind of separation.
We are a unique nation. Yeah.
So they either they either sign
Yep.
it or they don't. If they disagree completely, but whereas over here, the president approves, but the Senate doesn't.
But that being said, we could also recognize that European nations all have a little bit more concern about what's going on in Europe. For example, the United States doesn't feel the need, because of the Atlantic Ocean, to get involved in European issues. Britain, France, they see a need to be involved in European issues. So we don't sign the... And this has huge ramifications, guys. The fact that the United States is not a part of the League of Nations. And we're going to get back to this in a couple minutes. Keep in the back of your mind, the U.S. is not a part of the League of Nations. Also, at the beginning, the Soviet Union is not involved in the League of Nations. They're fighting their own civil war in the early 1920s. So the Soviets are not involved in the League of Nations. So now you've got the two of the biggest nations in the world with the most resources out of the League of Nations. Germany is not going to be allowed in the League of Nations initially. So you've got some pretty important players that are not involved in the League of Nations. I'm feeling like Peter Brady right now. I don't know if you guys are Brady Bunch people, but Peter Brady like hit maturity and his voice started to crack, and just when he had to sing, yes. So I feel like it's finally happening. All right, good. So I've been waiting. Maybe I can grow a full beard now. Anyway. So the United States, Germany, the Soviet Union aren't members of the League of Nations, at least initially for Germany and the Soviet Union. And the League of Nations is also weak in the sense that League member nations aren't compelled to send their military to support League issues. There is no League of Nations army. There's nothing that the League of Nations can really do to enforce League of Nations wishes. All there is the hope that this organization can, through negotiations, work out problems. We're going to see that that doesn't happen. All right, fast forwarding to some problems going on in Europe, particularly Germany. We remember the punishments that Germany faced at the end of World War I. They lost territory, not only around Germany and Europe, but also they lost their overseas holdings. They lost their military. They could only have an army of 100,000 men. No navy, no air force. Right? They were forced to sign the War Guilt Clause that was the basis for charging Germany with punitive reparations. When I say punitive, that means punishing. We're trying to punish Germany in order to have them pay for the war. So Germany, after World War I, is going to be straddled in an economic crisis. And that crisis is accelerated by the reparations payments that they are made to make to France and Britain and Belgium. All right? And we can see here from this chart, this is a chart of the value of one gold mark in the equivalent Deutsch paper marks, okay? So, like, you guys recognize that the money we used to have, for example, was backed by gold, and we got off of that back in the 1970s. Well, German marks, the paper money, the paper currency we have, is what's known as representative currency. It represents something else somewhere. So there's gold somewhere. Problem with gold is it's a finite resource, right? You only have so much gold until you can acquire more gold, find more gold, trade for more gold, all right? So nations' gold supplies are relatively finite. But paper, you can keep printing it, right? Well, in response to German economic problems, the German government in the interwar years, it was known as the Weimar Republic. It was based on a constitution that was written in a German city called Weimar. The German government started printing Deutschmarks at a faster rate than their economy was growing, at a faster rate than their nation was bringing in gold. And this started to cause inflation. Quick time out, if you guys recall from econ last year, inflation is a general rise in prices over time. All right? When inflation happens, it's a bad thing because it makes everybody that's got money in their pocket a little less wealthy. For example, today, if you can buy a McChicken sandwich for $1, but tomorrow it costs you $2 to buy a McChicken sandwich, if your wages don't increase, you are in essence poorer even when you have the same money in your pocket. Your money doesn't have what we call as the same purchasing power. Well, Germany in the early 1920s goes through what is known as hyperinflation, dramatically rapid inflation to the point where one gold mark would eventually be worth millions and then billions of paper marks. And we get anecdotes of Germans that are taking wheelbarrows full of paper marks to market to see what they can get for this wheelbarrow full of money, and then recognizing that the only thing that they actually have of value is not the paper money, but the wheelbarrow itself that they could possibly trade. It is absolutely crippling to the German economy. Yes?
And when German citizens get paid, they have to take all the money and run as quickly as possible to the place where they need to buy anything, because by the time they got to the place, the money already...
Price is already going up. Yes, absolutely. So this is a disaster for Germany. All right, so Germany is dealing with an economic crisis in the 1920s. Now, Thankfully for Germany, the United States is going to step up and help them be able to better pay off some loans and pay these reparations. We start to help orchestrate some new plans for repayment, but we don't have to get into the weeds of that. But this is bad for Germany, so we can recognize that World War I did not solve a lot of problems. It, in fact, is going to be creating some new ones. And then the economic problems of the early 20s will be accelerated by the time we get to the late 20s. This is the Great Depression. Now, you guys studied the Great Depression from an American history perspective last year. And that's really where it starts, guys. In the 1920s, a couple factors that I want to throw at you here really quick for the cause of the Great Depression. Overproduction of industry, overproduction of agriculture, will actually lead to plummeting prices, what we actually call deflation, which can be equally bad in an economy. Having like dramatic drops in prices, while that makes consumers really happy. Like you guys lived through it. You guys just lived through this, right? Like when gas prices were at $3, even $4 a gallon going back 5, 6, 7 years ago. Oh man, that was tough. But who was that good for?
The sellers.
The people producing it, the oil companies. And then the gas prices plummeted. And we were like, woohoo! And they went all the way down to like $2 and then $1.50 and even lower. And consumers were like, yeah, that's awesome.
That's not.
But producers were like, whoa, this isn't as good as you guys think it is. And then that's a disaster because as they're making less money, they might cut back on production. And when you cut back on production, we start to see growing unemployment lines, all right? And when there's growing unemployment lines, now even if the gas is cheaper or the food is cheaper, people can't afford it because they don't have jobs, all right? So one aspect to the cause of the Great Depression is going to be overproduction of economies. Now, this connects to World War I as well, guys. When World War I was happening, the United States was absolutely happy to churn out production to make up for the losses of European production. Not only industrial production, but also agriculturally. For example, in France and in Belgium, where the wars were fought, and in Russia, where the war was fought, there was a lot of agricultural land that was not being used because it was in the middle of a war zone. So American farmers did a lot, and Canadian farmers and Australian farmers did a lot to make up for that loss. And then the war comes to an end. And after a few years, European farms get back on track. Although occasionally they drive a tractor over an unexploded mine or shell and they blow up. There are people that are still dying from World War I today. All right, it happens. It's rare, but it happens. Sometimes in construction sites or whatnot, old explosives are found and sometimes they go off. So there are still occasionally reports of casualties from the First World War, even 100 years later. Anyway, once these European farms get back on track and they start producing, now you've got American farms producing at high levels with European farms coming back online. And now there's a glut of supply. Now, as you guys might have learned in econ last year, when there is relatively stagnant demand, because populations aren't skyrocketing right now, relatively stagnant demand, but a dramatic increase in supply as European farms come back online, what happens to the price of goods?
Drops.
They drop. And as they drop, farmers begin to bring in less money for what they sell. As farmers begin to bring in less money for what they sell, they might have a hard time paying their loans, paying the monthly payment on their loans or their mortgages. And a lot of American farmers in the 1920s and in the 19-teens took out big loans to buy more land and to buy more tractors and to buy more seed so they could grow bigger farms because everybody in the world wanted to buy their wares. And now they don't anymore. And as they can't pay back their loans anymore, as farmers are going to be going bankrupt, who suffers? The banks that made the loans. And so we begin to see in the late 1920s, banks begin to fail. All right? Well, if a bank fails, then everybody that's got their money invested in those banks, they lose. Or they panic and they freak out and they want to get the money out of the banks, and then the banks are like, whoa, we've got no money left anymore. Because where is all the bank's money? They loaned it out to people. That's how banks work. All right. This is, of course, before you guys learned last year how the federal government created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, that insures our money so we don't have to freak out like we used to. This is before that, right? So here's a couple causes, guys, of the Great Depression. Overproduction leading to dropping prices. A collapse of a banking industry. And then, adding into that last one, over-speculation on Wall Street. Speculation is the idea that we think something might be more valuable tomorrow than it is today. All right? And if you think something is going to be more valuable tomorrow than it is today, you want to buy it today and sell it tomorrow. All right? Well, in the 1920s, the United States had such a booming economy, and there was such tremendous, if you want, there was such tremendous growth in the American economy. The price, the value of American corporations that were traded on stock markets were increasing. Day after day. It was like a guarantee. If you invest in the market, that company is going to grow and you will turn a profit. People were so confident that these stock prices would continue to rise. Some even started to borrow money from banks in order to buy stocks. This is what's called an investing, buying on the margin. All right? You are borrowing money with the idea that that stock is going to increase in value. And when it does, you can sell that stock, pay back your loan, and put your profit in your pocket. That works when the markets are growing. But as issues with overproduction and prices and unemployment started to rear their head by the late 1920s, the American stock market is going to be hit. And by 1928-29, the American stock market is going to take a dramatic tumble. Which in and of itself wouldn't have been a disaster, but so many people had been buying stocks with borrowed money. And when you buy stocks with borrowed money and the stock price crashes, now you have to still pay back your loan. But you don't have the money to pay back your loan, because if you did, you wouldn't have borrowed money to buy the stocks in the first place. And when people can't pay back their loans, just like the farmers that couldn't pay back their loans, banks begin to go bankrupt. Individuals go bankrupt. Then banks go bankrupt. So, for our purposes here in AP World, the Great Depression hits. The Great Depression is not just an American thing, though. If you were involved in international trade of any kind, if your country did business with other nations, and by the 1920s, much of the world was trading with each other. All right? This is not a new phenomenon. If your country did business with other nations when the Great Depression was on, your country was being hit by the Great Depression. Some countries will be hit harder than others. Germany, for example, who was absolutely reliant on American aid and American loans to help them pay their reparations. Germany is going to be hit hard. Britain and France, who are deeply involved in trade with the United States, they're going to be hit hard by the Great Depression. The results of this Great Depression will bring a dramatic change into how Europeans and Americans look at the world. Before the Great Depression, we were looking at this, like, hey, everybody, let's get together, work out international problems, League of Nations, this is going to be good. After the Great Depression, nations said, hey, okay, the world is nice, but I've got to protect me first. Time out. In times of prosperity, think about your individual families. In times of prosperity, when things are going well, people are much more likely to do things like donate to charity or give of their time to donate to charity, right? And they're much more giving when we are comfortable, when our needs are taken care of, we are far more willing and able to help others, right? But when we have our own crisis afoot, if our own money is tight, if we have to work a lot of overtime and extra time, we have less ability and maybe less desire to contribute and help out others. The international world, by the Great Depression, proves the same thing. When times are going well, there's more ability to help out the world at large. But as times enter this economic crisis, we start to look inward and we try to protect ourselves. Tyler.
Also, when things are working, people tend to vote conservatively because it works before. And then when things like depressions hit, they try to vote radically.
Bring radical change? Yeah, I can see that. So with the Great Depression, and a dramatic rise in unemployment and an economic crisis around the world, nations, not just the United States, but the United States and Britain and France and Germany even, begin to look more inward. We've got to look out for ourselves. And their governments begin to pass a series of actions or laws or whatever that are referred to as protectionist. Protectionist policies. They want to protect their own industries. They want to protect their own economies. And the mother of all protectionist actions that we have seen since the mercantilist days is what?
Tariffs.
Very good. Tariffs. And the American government, for example, and we'll just be one of a number of countries that do these things, will pass a massive tariff bill called, anyone remember from APUSH?
Smoot-Hawley tariff.
Very good, the Smoot-Hawley tariff.
Whoa.
Or the Hawley-Smoot. It is called the Hawley-Smoot tariff bill because back in the day, Mr. Hawley and Mrs. Hawley and Mr. Smoot and Mrs. Smoot had kids who eventually went into Congress and passed a bill. All right? And this is a massive tariff bill to increase the price on imported goods in the United States, with the idea that Americans then would be more likely to buy American goods, right? The problem with passing protectionist policies, little tongue twister there, is other nations will do the same. They will retaliate against that. They will try to protect their own industries. And so if America is passing protectionist policies here, if Britain starts doing the same, now it becomes harder for American companies to sell to Britain. And that could hurt our economy as well. And most economists think that the passage of this tariff bill in the United States under Hoover's administration actually makes the Great Depression far worse than it otherwise would have been.
So it cripples the world economy?
It's going to continue to push the global economy downward. We will also see, instead of like the signs of international cooperation like the League of Nations that we saw in the 1920s, we will also begin to see nations acting aggressive in their own interests. And I'm going to give you 3 examples in a moment. But we will see other nations not wanting to deal with it. Like, I've got to worry about my own problems. I can't go and protect these other nations that are threatened. 3 nations that are going to start getting involved in aggressive overseas expansion will be Japan, Italy, and Germany. Yeah, we're pushing to World War II here. This is absolutely, guys, an AP World Cliff Notes version of the 20th century. All right? I'm leaving a lot of things out. We're going very quickly here. But we've got Japan, Italy, and Germany. And Japan starts the ball rolling. And it shouldn't surprise us that Japan starts the ball rolling because Japan is a relatively small island nation with relatively few natural resources compared to its population. All right? And so Japan, which had been growing since the Meiji Restoration, they've been industrializing, they've been westernizing. Japan begins to look overseas. And in the protectionism of the Great Depression, Japan says this to itself: self, other countries might stop selling to us. So we better go get our own right now. We need to look out for ourselves. And guess what? In the midst of the global economic crisis, I don't think the rest of the world is going to stop us. So in 1931, Japan trumps up an excuse to invade Manchuria. They claim some Manchurians opened fire on some Japanese rail workers in Manchuria. It's garbage. 1931. Japan invaded Manchuria. And they will quickly take over Manchuria. And they create out of Manchuria what we would call a puppet state, called Manchukuo. where they actually take a guy named Pu Yi. You might have heard his name in this class before. I don't know if I mentioned him. Pu Yi was the last emperor of the Qing dynasty in China.
When he was a puppet.
I'm going to get there. Pu Yi was the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. Remember the Qing were Manchurians? Okay, so in Japan,